Brian Ingram was only 8 years old when he stumbled upon some of the only physical evidence ever produced around one of the most fascinating crimes in American history. It was the middle of winter, and Brian was camping with his family on a beach along the Columbia River. It was cold in the forest of southern Washington state, and the boy's parents asked him to dig a fire pit out of the sand for the family to sit around that evening. As he was digging, his hands wrapped around something odd buried beneath the sand. Felt like an old newspaper hiding under the soil. And what he pulled out of the sand looked like a stack of cash. The bills were disintegrated and torn in many places, as if they had been buried in that spot for many years. But the distinct face of Andrew Jackson was still visible. Brian continued to dig, and it didn't take long before he had uncovered 2 more stacks of bills. Each of the stacks, which were still bundled neatly in rubber bands, was in as bad of condition as the first. Brought the money over to his parents, who took a look at his discovery. They didn't know where the money had come from or who it belonged to, so his parents decided the best thing to do with the cash was to turn it over to authorities. The local police took the bills from the Ingrams and passed them on to the FBI for further analysis. And once the feds got their hands on the buried cash, the first thing they did was trace the serial numbers from the bills that hadn't fallen to pieces. What they found was shocking. The money was not from a recent crime or robbery, but instead could be traced back to an event that took place 9 years earlier over the skies of Washington. Brian Ingram had stumbled onto $5,800 of the $200,000 ransom payment that had been given to the mysterious and now infamous hijacker known as D.B Cooper. This money was given right before the man had jumped from a hijacked airplane into a cold, dark, rainy night in November and disappeared without a trace. And for the first time in almost a decade, there was hard evidence to give clues as to what might have happened to D.B Cooper. But rather than bringing answers to the mystery, Brian's discovery would only end up digging up more questions about the events of that stormy night in the skies of the Pacific Northwest. After all the passengers and crew aboard the hijacked flight were safe, the FBI wasted no time opening a case file and searching whatever evidence they could to identify who Cooper really was. They interviewed hundreds of suspects, tracked down leads from every corner of the country, and scoured the woods of Oregon and Washington for any evidence of the man or his money. Only a few small pieces of evidence were recovered from the plane: the mangled remains of the second parachute, his black tie and mother-of-pearl tie tack, 8 Raleigh cigarette butts, and 66 possible fingerprints. Each one of these pieces of physical evidence seemed like it might hold the key to unlocking Cooper's identity at different points during the investigation, only for a series of mysterious coincidences to impede the investigation right as momentum seemed to be building. The most promising lead of all came from the 8 cigarette butts, which were recovered from the ashtray of the seat Cooper had ridden in the entire flight before his jump. By the year 1998, DNA had progressed far enough that investigators thought extracting saliva from the butts might be their best chance at identifying the missing fugitive. They sent word to the Las Vegas FBI field office to have the cigarettes brought out of storage in order to be examined, only to discover that the butts had been destroyed in the years since Cooper's jump. And unfortunately, these items weren't much to work off of, and gradually months of investigation turned into years with no substantial leads for the authorities. According to the FBI's own history of the case, more than 800 suspects were considered in the first 5 years of the investigation, but all of them were eventually eliminated except for a few dozen. Ironically, one of the suspects considered and then eliminated from the list was a Portland man named D.B Cooper. A reporter following the case made a small typo in an article he printed in which he switched the name of the suspect with the name the hijacker had provided, which, as we said, was Dan Cooper. Somehow, this mistake was republished by other media outlets, and before long the whole country had picked up on the name of the sky pirate as D.B Cooper. There are so many questions around Cooper and the mystery of what happened that stormy night, but one in particular has always been on the top of the list. Did he survive his jump from the 727? We'll start with the less fun side, supporting the idea that Cooper did not survive his jump. Most of the people who believe that Cooper was killed in his jump from the plane point to the simple evidence of how unprepared he seemed for the parachuting portion of his escape. Let's start with the gear that Cooper had chosen. Although he had been offered a military parachute, he had actually chosen a civilian chute with a manually operated ripcord. More importantly, this type of parachute could not be steered. When you combine this with the near zero visibility of the ground that he would have had from the place he jumped, it seems that Cooper was relying entirely on luck to determine where he actually landed. Making the case for Cooper's survival even less likely is the outfit he was wearing when he jumped. Cooper was dressed in a thin suit and trench coat and was wearing nothing on his feet but loafers. This clothing was not well suited for jumping out of an airplane. It wouldn't have protected him from the substantial wind chill while he was in the air, or from exposure to the elements after he landed. The loafers in particular present a major problem, as they most likely would have been ripped off his feet as soon as he jumped by the intense wind speed. Even if they had stayed on, they wouldn't have protected him during landing, and he would have been a serious risk to break his ankles or legs when he hit the ground. Now, there is one piece of evidence that might help answer questions about Cooper's poorly chosen gear. One of the items that he carried with him on the plane was a brown paper bag. Nobody knows for certain what Cooper had inside the bag, but it was never used for any purpose while he was on the plane. It's entirely possible that Cooper was keeping important items for the jump inside the bag, things like boots, goggles, and a jacket that would have been crucial to surviving. But even if this was the case, it doesn't answer the question about the overall riskiness of the jump. Because of the fact that Cooper seemed not to care exactly what course the plane flew on, and even let the pilot choose Reno as the refueling location, seems to indicate that Cooper's plans didn't include a specific location or area in which he would jump and land. In summary, it seems that Cooper was relying on a shocking amount of luck for a man whose plan was so precise in every other movement leading up to the jump. But just because Cooper was taking a risk with his leap out of the plane doesn't make it impossible to believe that he might have survived. Even if the odds were low, it's entirely possible he managed to drift down and land in a flat area rather than the heavy forests of Oregon. In fact, there were actually a couple of real-life demonstrations over the years after Cooper's jump that his survival was possible. Using Cooper as an inspiration, there were actually 5 different men who attempted copycat hijackings in the months after his story caught the public's attention, and all 5 of these men survived their parachute jump. And of course, although none of the circumstances were exactly identical, none of the others were facing the combination of darkness and hostile weather that Cooper was, certainly makes it seem like a distinct possibility that Cooper might have successfully landed on the ground safely. This dovetails nicely into the side of the argument in support of Cooper's survival. This side too, there's very little physical evidence and lots of conjecture. But of course, there is one significant development that might swing the whole debate in favor of Cooper's survival. That crucial item, or 3 items more specifically, is the money that was discovered by little Brian Ingram on the shore of the Columbia River. Now, the $5,800 that Brian dug up on Tina Bar Beach has become sort of a mystery within the mystery. For one thing, although the bills were badly disintegrated by the time Brian dug them up, they were still in better shape than experts would expect for cash left out in such harsh conditions. If the money had somehow landed in the river and drifted to the shores of Tina Bar right after Cooper jumped, then 10 years of rain and exposure should have left the bills not much more than a pile of mush by the time the boys stumbled upon them. This is made all the more evident by the presence of the rubber bands that were still wrapped around the bills at the time of his discovery, showing that the specific type of rubber bands used with the bills could not have survived exposure to the elements for longer than a year before they fell apart completely. For many people, this leaves only one conclusion. The bills must have been placed in the sand sometime in the year before Brian's discovery. If this is the case, could it have been possible that Cooper lived and returned years after his escape to leave the bills on the shore of Tina Bar? To go even further down the rabbit hole, many people have pointed out the obvious coincidence of the similarities between Tina Bar, the place where the bills were found, and Tina Mucklow, the airline stewardess who sat beside him throughout his escape. Cooper fanatics, and again this is way down the rabbit hole, ask the question of could that location have been an intentional sign left by Cooper, perhaps as a tribute to the woman who had endured the intense few hours on the plane with him. And if you missed part 1 on the D.B Cooper mystery, Tina Mucklow was the flight attendant who sat with D.B Cooper for around 2 hours before they landed in Seattle. To go through in depth all the suspects in the D.B Cooper case would deserve a video of its own, but through the years there have been some fascinating suspects, but yet the case has gone cold for decades. But after many years going without a new lead, the FBI officially suspended the case in 2016 on under the need to use resources elsewhere. But despite the investigation officially ending, the interest in D.B. Cooper and the case has never faded and gone far from the public's imagination.